friends. Welcome to the Biology Forum. Today we move on with the next topic on our current ongoing lecture series on chemical coordination and integration. We have learnt about the different glands in our body, the speciality of endocrine glands, the secretions of endocrine glands called hormones. In this lecture, we are going to talk about these very secretions, that is the hormones, and how they act on our body. So let's begin. Let us first again have a recap of the definition of hormones. Hormones by definition are non-nutrient chemicals which act as intercellular messengers and are produced in trace amounts. So we also call them as the chemical messengers in our body, and they are needed in real trace amounts. However, hypo or hyper secretion of these hormones definitely has an effect on our body. Now, depending on the nature of these hormones, we have different types, actually 4 different types of hormones. Let's see. The first type are peptides, polypeptides, or protein hormones. They are proteins by nature. For example, insulin, glucagon from the pancreas, the pituitary and the hypothalamic hormones all are proteins by nature. The second type, they are the steroids. Examples, cortisol, testosterone, the androgens, estradiol and progesterone are steroids by nature. We also have the iodothyronins where iodine forms an important constituent. Example is thyroid hormones. So we have the T3 and T4 hormones, that is triiodothyronin and tetraiodothyronin. These are the hormones from the thyroid, are basically iodothyronins. The fourth type are the amino acid derivatives. Example is epinephrine or your adrenaline. Now that we know the types of hormones in our body, we should also be knowing how they act on our body. So let us see the mechanism of action. Hormones, as I have told you, since they are secreted by the endocrine glands, they do not have ducts, so they flow through blood. So hormones circulate through blood either as free molecules as they are, or sometimes they are bound to proteins. What they do is they produce their effect on target organs by binding to specific proteins called hormone receptors, which are located on the target tissues only. Because the question that comes to our mind is that when hormones are going to travel through the blood and blood reaches each and every organ and each and every cell of our body, so does the hormone show its effect on each and every cell? No, it will show its effect only on the target tissues, because these target tissues are the ones which have special receptors called as hormone receptors. So what happens is these receptors may be present either on the cell membrane of the target cells. Such cells are called as the membrane bound receptors because they are present on the cell membrane, or they may be present inside the target cell. In that case, we call them as the intracellular receptors. Such kind are mostly nuclear receptors. So we have 2 types of receptors for these hormones on the target tissues. One, the membrane bound receptors, and second, the intracellular receptors. So depending on this, it's literally like a lock and key mechanism. A particular hormone will bind with a particular receptor only because it fits into that particular receptor. So as it is moving, as a hormone is circulating through the blood, it will come across many receptors on in its entire journey, but it will only bind to that specific receptor because it is going to only fit into that. It's like a lock and key mechanism. Similar kind of a lock and key mechanism you get to see with the enzyme and substrate. A similar process is also seen here. Now, this kind of binding, the moment the hormone fits into the receptor and binds with it, it might be a membrane bound or an intracellular receptor, doesn't matter. It immediately forms a hormone receptor complex. The moment this complex is formed, it leads to changes within the cell. There will be biochemical and physiological changes within the cell, and this creates the response from the target tissue. A simple example, if there is elevated blood sugar or elevated glucose in the blood, what happens is the insulin that is secreted by the pancreas will come and bind with the receptor. Immediately, there will be biochemical and physiological changes within the cell. This will increase the permeability of glucose into the cell. So glucose will enter into the cell, thereby reducing the level of blood glucose. Simple thing is, it does not happen with just one cell, it will happen with many cells, and in the process, blood sugar level comes down to normal. This is how this mechanism works. It is so very specific. So now let's see how, out of the different types of hormones, how do proteins and amine derivative hormones work? The protein and amine derivative hormones, where we talk about insulin, glucagon, the pituitary hormones, the hypothalamic hormones, adrenaline, all these, how do they react? They interact with membrane-bound receptors. They are water soluble and therefore cannot enter the lipid bilayer of the cell membrane. So it is very difficult for them to pass through. So they need to bind with the membrane-bound receptors. Once they bind with the receptor, what happens is they form the hormone receptor complex. Immediately it generates secondary messengers within the cell like cyclic AMP, IP3, calcium ions. So there are biochemical and physiological changes within the cell which regulates the cellular metabolism, brings about changes in the metabolism. Examples of this: insulin, glucagon, your pituitary hormones, and your hypothalamic hormones. Right, you have, if you can see here, this is the hormone which very much fits into the receptor like a lock and key. Immediately there are changes, if you can see, changes within the cell, and this brings about changes in the metabolism, and that is how this hormone acts. These are the protein and amine derivative hormones. This is how they act. Then how do steroids and thyroid hormones act? These hormones are lipid soluble. The steroid and thyroid hormones are lipid soluble, so they can very easily pass through the lipid bilayer of the cell membrane. So because of this, they do not need any membrane-bound receptors. They can very easily pass through this and enter into the cell. Once they enter into the cell, these hormones interact with the intracellular receptors. Generally, they are nuclear receptors. So here they come and actually regulate gene expression. They work at the level of the genes and show their action there. And they function by interaction of the hormone receptor complex with the genome. So basically, they are going to directly show their action on the genome. And because of this, there will be cumulative biochemical actions which results in physiological effects within the cell, and that is how these hormones act. Along with the endocrine glands, we had talked about endocrine glands secreting hormones. There are other isolated cells within our body which also secrete hormones. Let's have a look. The hormones of heart, kidney, and the gastrointestinal tract. All hormones in our body are not only secreted by the endocrine glands alone. Some tissues in our body also secrete hormones, like the atrial wall of our heart secretes the atrial natriuretic factor. The juxtaglomerular cells, or the JG cells of the kidney, they release or secrete a peptide hormone called erythropoietin. And there are endocrine cells in different parts of our gastrointestinal tract like gastrin, secretin, cholecystokinin, also called CCK, and the gastric inhibitory peptidase, or a GIP. Let us see how they act in our body. Where does the ANF come into action? The atrial natriuretic factor decreases the blood pressure. So whenever the blood pressure increases in our body, the ANF is secreted, which causes dilatation of the blood vessels, and as a result there will be some amount of reduction in our blood pressure. The juxtaglomerular cells, which are from the kidneys, the JG cells, secrete erythropoietin, which stimulates, as the name suggests, erythropoiesis. Erythrocytes are the red blood cells. Poiesis is formation, so it helps in the formation of new RBCs through the bone marrow. So erythropoietin is very, very important for the process of erythropoiesis. Now we talk about the hormones of the gastrointestinal tract and how they act. Gastrin acts on the gastric glands and stimulates secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. These are the enzymes. So you can see that even isolated cells within our body also show hormonal action. Secretin acts on the exocrine pancreas. So it is that part of the pancreas which helps in digestion by producing the pancreatic juice. So it acts on the exocrine part of pancreas, stimulates the secretion of water and bicarbonate ions. This is basically to reduce the acidity of the food, that the chyme that enters from the stomach into the duodenum. It has to be neutralized. So bicarbonate ions from the pancreatic juice, which is because of the secretin, neutralizes this acidic chyme. CCK or cholecystokinin acts on pancreas and the gallbladder. So it stimulates secretion of pancreatic enzymes and the bile juice, because gallbladder stores the bile juice which is secreted by the liver cells. So it needs that the bile juice is also needed for emulsification of the fats. GIP, gastric inhibitory peptidase, inhibits gastric motility. So it reduces the motility of the GI tract. So you can see we have cells also isolated here and there, not actually endocrine glands, but they show their action in the form of endocrine, the hormones. Let us now learn about the negative feedback mechanism seen in the endocrine system to maintain homeostasis, or sort of an equilibrium within our body, because no gland or no organ can just keep on secreting its secretions without some kind of a regulation. So let us see how it works by taking the example of the thyroid gland. The T3, T4 are the thyroid hormones. If the level of the T3, T4 hormones in the blood is low, the hypothalamus immediately gets triggered, the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus, and it releases the thyrotropin releasing hormone, which will move through the portal circulation to the anterior lobe of the pituitary and trigger the release of TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone. This TSH flows through the blood and shows its action on the thyroid gland and stimulates it to start secreting T3 and T4. The cells of the thyroid will start secreting T3 and T4, which goes into circulation and acts on the target cells of the body. Now this keeps on, the cells will keep on secreting T3, T4, and the level will keep on rising. Now when the level keeps on rising, especially if T3, T4, immediately the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary will get triggered by this raised levels of T3, T4, and hypothalamus will stop its TRH release. At the same time, anterior pituitary too will reduce or stop its TSH release. As a result, the stimulation to the thyroid will slowly reduce, and T3, T4 levels will come back to normal. So nothing can go on continuously as it is. There is some kind of a regulation. So the endocrine system maintains homeostasis by the negative feedback mechanism. So this is a feedback that the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are getting through the blood by the levels of hormones. So we call this as the negative feedback mechanism. Similar thing, you can see any stimulus will immediately stimulate the hypothalamus to release TRH, which will act on the anterior pituitary to release TSH, stimulates the thyroid to release thyroid hormones, which will act on the target cells. When it is more, it will again re-stimulate the hypothalamus and the anterior lobe of the pituitary to stop the secretion of the TRH and TSH. This is entirely negative feedback mechanism. So I hope you have most of your doubts on this, on hormones and their action in our body is cleared. If you have any doubts, please put your doubts in the comment section. I will definitely answer them. This is the second part of the topic on chemical coordination in our body. We will be having many more lectures on the different glands in the body. So keep watching. Thank you.